Throughout the Absaroka Mountains, the wind did far more than just blow. It stalked its prey with deliberate intent. Every vulnerability became a target for its relentless pursuit. Like a predator, it would snake its way through the tiniest openings in a man's coat, worm into boots that had split from wear, and push its icy touch against his very soul, until he had no choice but to surrender or shatter completely. During that bitter winter of 1887, Wyoming's high country belonged entirely to that merciless wind. Within that harsh and unforgiving territory, a lone mountain man would stumble into events that were destined to transform an entire valley for all time. The wind was an old companion to Caleb Mercer. By the age of 38, more than half of his existence had been spent among these peaks. He'd deliberately chosen the straightforward truth of ice and rock over the deception and chaos that filled the towns below. Standing tall with broad shoulders, he carried himself with the unhurried assurance of someone who had little reason to feel afraid. The buckskin clothing he wore had grown threadbare with use, while his heavy fur coat bore numerous patches, and even when he remained motionless, his beard glistened with frozen crystals. It was the 14th of November in 1887. Above him, the sky pressed down low and ominous, colored like a bruise that had gone deep beneath the skin. The old-timers in these parts would speak later of how storms of this magnitude appeared only once in a person's lifetime. Following a trail of faint blood droplets across snow that had been packed down hard, Caleb tracked an elk he'd wounded earlier. His breathing created thick white clouds in the frigid air as he glided soundlessly between the trees. Upon reaching the top of a slender ridge, he came to an abrupt halt. Stretched out below him was a box canyon that locals knew as Dead Man's Drop. People from the area kept their distance from this place. Sunlight almost never found its way to the canyon floor, and the cold seemed to settle there like some kind of curse. That's when Caleb noticed something that caused his grip to tighten instinctively on his rifle's stock. There was smoke rising. A slender ribbon of gray spiraled upward, standing out against the backdrop of dark pine trees. Nobody made their home in Dead Man's Drop. The previous person who'd attempted to live there had frozen to death 3 full years ago. Caleb abandoned the elk's trail completely. While curiosity had a way of getting men killed in these high mountains, his instincts were what kept him breathing. After strapping on his snowshoes, he began making his way down the slope with deliberate caution. Drawing nearer, he was able to make out where the smoke originated. What he saw couldn't really be called a proper cabin at all. The structure resembled nothing so much as a heap of driftwood that had somehow managed to stay upright. In the middle, the roof had collapsed inward. Between the logs, gaps yawned wide enough that you could see clear through to the other side. Hanging askew on just one leather hinge, the door looked ready to fall off completely. Caleb crouched low behind a boulder and retrieved a small brass spyglass from his pack. Raising it to his eye, he expected to spot either a drifter passing through or perhaps an outlaw on the run. What he found instead caught him completely off guard: a woman. She was petite and gaunt, her body wrapped in multiple layers of wool and rags that had been torn to shreds. Out in the snow, she struggled with an axe that was clearly far too heavy for her to handle properly. Every swing she took looked like it caused her pain, and the blade would bounce harmlessly off the frozen log without making any real progress. Eventually, she dropped down onto her knees and pressed her face into her hands. Caleb lowered the spyglass slowly. Something about this wasn't right at all. Here was a woman by herself, 20 miles distant from the nearest settlement, with a storm approaching that could easily bury an entire house before morning arrived. For a considerable time, he simply watched, waiting to see whether anyone else might appear. Nobody else came. The smoke drifting from the chimney looked weak and washed out in color. What she was burning was green wood, still full of moisture. Either she didn't understand that this was wrong, or she'd simply run out of any other options. The wind shifted and began to scream, its pitch high and cutting, the particular sound that always preceded heavy snowfall. Caleb lived by certain rules. One of them was staying clear of other people's business. He'd abandoned the world of men precisely because it overflowed with greed and cruelty. But allowing someone to freeze to death wasn't something his code would permit. Rising to his feet, he slung his rifle across his shoulder and started making his way down the hill toward the cabin. That one decision marked the end of his life as a ghost and the beginning of something far more perilous. He made no attempt to approach silently. Taking a desperate person by surprise was a good way to get yourself killed. Instead, he walked heavily through the snow and called out loudly, "Hello, the house!" The woman whirled around, her eyes going wide with terror. She let the wood drop from her hands and scrambled backward toward the door, her hands fumbling around inside her coat. "Stay back!" The words came out as a scream. Caleb stopped moving when he was still 10 yards away and lifted both his empty hands high, where she could see them. "I'm not here to cause you any harm. There's a storm coming in, a bad one too." From inside her coat, she produced a rusty revolver, though her hands were shaking so violently that the barrel wobbled all over the place. "I have a gun," she said. "I can see that clearly enough," Caleb responded in a calm voice. "But unless you've got dry firewood and meat stored up in that shack of yours, that gun's not going to do much to stop the cold." The sky was darkening with frightening speed. Snow had started to fall, coming in sideways, driven with force by the wind. "Who sent you?" she demanded to know. "Was it Halloway? Did Halloway send you here?" The name hit him like a physical blow. Jubel Halloway was the wealthiest rancher in the entire territory, a man whose possessions included land, lawmen, and the ability to make people keep quiet. "I don't ride for Halloway," Caleb stated firmly. "I don't ride for anybody at all." Moving with deliberate slowness, he reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle containing dried meat and pemmican. He tossed it gently so that it landed in the snow near her feet. "Eat something." Hunger proved stronger than fear. She snatched up the food and tore into it like someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Caleb took a single step closer to her. "That roof isn't going to hold up. That door won't do anything to stop the wind from getting in. If I turn around and leave you here, you'll be dead before morning comes." She swallowed with difficulty. "Why would you care about that?" "I don't," he said, though it was a lie. "But I'm not the kind of man who walks past a grave he could have prevented." A powerful gust of wind tore a shingle loose from the roof and sent it tumbling away into the darkness. She looked at the cabin for a long moment, then back at the towering figure of the man standing in the snow before her. "I don't have anything I could pay you with," she whispered quietly. "I didn't ask you for payment," he replied. She lowered the gun. Caleb walked past where she stood and stepped through the doorway into the cabin. The smell was what hit him first, a mixture of old ash, damp rotting wood, and raw fear. He turned back to face her. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she answered softly. "Sarah Jenkins is my name." "All right then, Sarah Jenkins," Caleb said as he dropped his pack onto the floor. "We've got work that needs doing." The storm held them captive for 3 full days. Beyond the cabin walls, the world disappeared entirely into white fury. Snow piled itself up against the walls until it reached 6 feet high. The wind hammered against the cabin as though it was angry and wanted to get inside. Within those walls, Caleb worked without taking any rest. He reinforced the roof using a fallen pine tree he'd dragged in. He packed a mixture of mud and snow into every gap between the logs. From his own gear, he cut strips of leather to repair the broken door. When nightfall came, the fire was roaring strong. For the first time in weeks, warmth actually stayed inside the cabin instead of escaping through the cracks. They exchanged hardly any words. Sarah slept with the revolver tucked under her hand. Caleb slept in a sitting position with his rifle laid across his lap. On the morning of the 3rd day, The wind finally died away. The silence that settled over everything felt heavy and strange, almost unnatural. By the fire, Caleb skinned a rabbit he'd caught. Sarah sat close by, and slowly the color began returning to her face. "You told me you don't ride for Halloway," she said to him. "That's right, I don't." "He's searching for me," she said. "I figured as much." From inside her boot, she pulled out a small leather journal. "I used to keep his books. I saw the ledgers, all of them. He pays men to burn out homesteaders. He pays sheriffs and judges, too. I took this journal and I ran." Caleb looked at the book and grasped the situation immediately. "That right there is a death warrant you're carrying." "It's the truth," she insisted. "The truth doesn't stop bullets from flying," he said. He turned his gaze out the window at the clearing sky. "The storm's broken now. That means men will be coming." "Are you planning to leave?" she asked, her voice quiet. Caleb looked at her directly. She was thin from hunger but brave, still standing strong. "No," he said firmly. "I'm finished with running away." She swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Caleb's jaw tightened with determination. "We turn this place into something that can fight back when they come." He looked around at the broken cabin and gave a single nod. "But first," he added, "we make sure winter doesn't kill us before those men even get the chance to try." Winter settled itself into Dead Man's Drop with a crushing, suffocating weight. The storm that had nearly taken Sarah's life was merely the beginning of what was to come. Snow no longer drifted down softly and gently. Instead, it hardened into solid ice and sealed the valley shut like a tomb. The sun showed itself only as a pale glare appearing above the rim of the canyon, never once touching the ground where the cabin sat concealed. Every single day, Caleb worked like a man who was racing against time itself. He didn't simply patch up the cabin's weak spots. He transformed the entire structure. He studied carefully the way the wind moved through the space, observing how it would scream down the canyon walls and probe for any gaps it could find. Then, he fought back against it using wood, snow, and sheer, stubborn determination. He cut hundreds of spruce boughs and showed Sarah the technique for weaving them into thick, protective mats. Working together, they nailed these mats to the outside walls and then packed snow over the top of them. Gradually, the cabin began to disappear under white layers, becoming indistinguishable from the mountain itself. Inside the cabin, the air grew still and considerably warmer. The biting cold began to loosen its grip on them. "Snow traps air inside it," Caleb explained to her. "And that air is what keeps us alive." Finding food became their next priority. Caleb taught Sarah how to read the land the same way animals did. He pointed out broken branches, faint tracks in snow, and specific places where rabbits always seemed to pass through. She learned the skill of setting snares using wire that they'd pulled from rusted junk left behind by long-gone prospectors. They smoked meat over the fire, hanging thin strips from the rafters, until the entire cabin smelled of wood smoke and survival. Buried under snow in a collapsed shed nearby, Caleb discovered an old iron stove. It took him half a day of hard labor to drag it inside the cabin. He propped it up with stones, fixed the stovepipe, and transformed it into the heart of their home. From birchwood, he carved bowls and spoons. He built shelves along the walls. He even crafted a pair of snowshoes for Sarah from ashwood and rawhide strips. As the days continued to pass, the silence between them began to soften and grow more comfortable. Sarah proved herself to be sharp-minded and capable. She rationed their supplies with careful attention to detail. Using thread that she'd pulled from her own skirt, she mended Caleb's torn coat, and she cleaned his rifle until it gleamed. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Sarah broke the comfortable quiet. "You got family, Mercer?" Caleb's carving knife paused in mid-stroke. "Had a wife once. Mary was her name. And a boy." Sarah looked up at him. "What happened to them?" "Winter sickness," he said flatly, without emotion. Took them both at the same time. I burned the house down to the ground and walked into the mountains after that. She reached out and rested her hand gently on his arm. I am sorry for your loss. Pain just means you're still breathing, he said to her. But he didn't pull his arm away from her touch. Sarah told him about her own father. She described how Halloway's men had burned their homestead to the ground. She explained how the law had called it an accident and closed the case. She told him how she'd taken the bookkeeping job specifically to expose the truth, even if doing so ended up killing her. 2 wounded people, bound together by loss, learning how to survive side by side. But peace wasn't destined to last. Late in December, Caleb was outside chopping wood when the forest suddenly went quiet around him. Birds vanished from sight. Squirrels disappeared. His instincts screamed at him that danger was near. A rifle shot shattered the silence into pieces. The bullet tore into the doorframe of the cabin, sending splinters flying in every direction. "Get down!" Caleb shouted at the top of his lungs. Sarah hit the floor hard, her hand clutching the revolver that Caleb had taught her how to clean and maintain. Caleb slid over to the window slit and scanned the ridge above them carefully. High ground, he muttered under his breath. Professional shooter. More shots followed in rapid succession. 3 men appeared from the trees, moving with confidence and carelessness. "We know you're in there," one of them called out loudly. "Mr. Halloway wants his property returned to him." Caleb slipped out through the hidden rear tunnel they dug. He moved through the snow and timber like a shadow, circling wide around their position. When he finally fired his rifle, the lead man fell screaming into the snow. The other 2 panicked immediately. They hadn't been prepared for a hunter who knew every single inch of this land. Caleb stepped into full view, his rifle held steady. "You go back and tell Halloway something for me," he said coldly, his voice like ice. "You come here again, and I won't be aiming to wound next time." The men fled in terror, dragging their injured companion behind them through the snow. Sarah stood shaking in the doorway when Caleb returned to the cabin. "That wasn't the end of it," he said grimly, his face dark. "That was just a message being sent." That night, Caleb lifted up a loose floorboard and revealed a crate that had been buried underneath. Inside the crate were sticks of old dynamite from his mining days years ago. Sarah stared at them in disbelief. "You planning on starting a war?" Caleb nodded slowly. They already started one. Over the days that followed, he transformed the canyon itself into a weapon. He climbed the ridges surrounding them and placed charges at weak points in the snowpack. He ran fuses through hidden paths, with all of them leading back to a single detonator, positioned near the cabin. "They'll come at dawn," Caleb said one night, staring out at the moonlit snow covering everything. Tobias Halloway will be leading them personally. When morning arrived, the sound of thunder echoed through the canyon. 40 riders filled the valley floor below. Tobias rode at the very front of the group, a smile on his face. "Send out the girl," Tobias called up to them. "Do that and I'll let you live," Caleb answered him with gunfire instead of words. The attack that followed was absolutely brutal. Bullets shredded the cabin walls to pieces. Men advanced from every side at once. Fire began to spread when torches struck the porch. "I have to reach the detonator," Caleb said urgently. He ran for it. Gunfire tore up the snow all around him as he moved. A bullet grazed his leg, drawing blood. When he reached the rock where the detonator was hidden, his heart dropped into his stomach. The wire had been cut clean through. The charges were completely useless now. Caleb looked up at the mountain looming above, then back at the men who were closing in on him from all sides. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at the last remaining charge positioned high up on the cliff face. He stepped out into the open, where everyone could see him. "Look up," he roared with everything he had. He fired the shot. For a single moment, nothing happened at all. Then the mountain gave its answer. The avalanche roared down the slope, swallowing horses and men and gunfire in a massive wall of white destruction. Caleb dove into the tunnel as the entire world collapsed around him. Inside the buried cabin, complete darkness fell over everything. The roof bowed inward dangerously, but managed to hold. The silence that followed was thick and absolutely terrifying. "Sarah!" Caleb called out into the darkness. "I'm here," she answered him back. They were alive, but they were buried, and they were running out of air to breathe. Caleb stared upward at the stovepipe. "We dig upward," he said with determination, "or we die here in the dark." And there, in the crushing darkness beneath the mountain's weight, their fight for survival began all over again. The silence that came after the avalanche was somehow worse than all the noise had been. It pressed against the cabin walls like something alive and malicious. The wind had vanished completely. The world outside had ceased to exist. Caleb lay flat on the dirt floor, his ears ringing painfully, his chest burning as he dragged air into lungs that already felt thin and heavy with strain. "Sarah," he said again, louder this time, forcing the words out. "I'm here," she answered from somewhere near the stove. Her voice was shaking, but it was steady enough to give him a measure of hope. Caleb struck a match against the floor. The small flame revealed the truth of their situation in harsh detail. The cabin had shrunk around them. The roof sagged dangerously low in the center, threatening to collapse. Snow pressed through every crack and crevice, sealing them in completely. They were buried deep beneath the surface, maybe under 10 feet of packed ice and snow, possibly even more than that. "Did we stop them?" Sarah asked him. Caleb nodded in the flickering light. The mountain did the job. They had heat, but barely enough to matter. They had food, but only for a short while longer. What they didn't have was time running in their favor. The air would turn against them long before hunger ever became the problem. Sarah grabbed the shovel with both hands. "We dig our way out." Caleb stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Not through the door. If we open that up, the snow pours straight in and crushes us flat." He looked upward at the stovepipe. "That's our way out of here." For 2 full days they worked in darkness and sweat, their bodies aching. They fed the fire with everything they could possibly burn: furniture, shelves, even floorboards torn up from beneath their feet. Heat rose up through the pipe, melting a narrow pocket in the snow above them, inch by painful inch. Caleb climbed up onto the table and stabbed upward with an iron poker, chipping away at ice one small piece at a time. The air inside grew increasingly foul and hard to breathe. Sarah's breathing became shallow and labored. Caleb's vision began to narrow down to a tunnel. "Stay with me," he said firmly, forcing himself to keep moving despite exhaustion. On the second night, the poker struck something above that shifted when he hit it. A blast of cold air rushed down the pipe, stealing their breath for a moment, but ultimately saving their lives. They cried then, both of them together, gasping for air and laughing at the same time in relief. Digging upward took another full day of back-breaking work. Hands bled freely, muscles locked up and refused to cooperate. Finally, the shovel broke through into blue sky above. Caleb pulled himself out first, immediately collapsing onto the avalanche debris. He reached back down into the hole and dragged Sarah up into the light. Dead Man's Drop had been erased from existence. The canyon had been filled in completely, flattened by the massive amount of snow. Trees had been snapped like twigs. Of Tobias Halloway and his 40 men, there was absolutely no sign remaining, just a torn saddle blanket that flapped in the wind from a broken pine tree. "They're gone," Sarah whispered in disbelief. Caleb nodded slowly. Buried deep under all that snow. They had won the fight against Halloway's men, but their survival was far from finished. They had no horses left. They had very little food remaining. Their clothing was ruined and falling apart. South Pass City lay 40 miles away through difficult terrain. "We walk," Sarah said simply, as if there was no other option. The journey that followed became a legend told and retold. They pushed through deep drifts that threatened to swallow them. They slept buried under pine needles for warmth. They shared body heat to keep from freezing to death in the night. Wolves followed them one night, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness like lanterns. Caleb stayed awake through it all, growling softly at the pack, until they finally melted back into the trees. On the fourth day of walking, Sarah collapsed in the snow. Her boots had worn completely through. Her feet were frozen solid. Caleb didn't hesitate for even a second. He lifted her onto his back and carried her mile after mile, his legs burning. But he kept speaking to her constantly, telling her stories, doing whatever he could to keep her awake and conscious. When they finally staggered into South Pass City, people stopped and stared as if they were witnessing ghosts walking straight out of the mountains. A miner dropped his tools when he caught sight of them. They were taken inside immediately. The doctor worked through the entire night without rest. Sarah survived, though it was close. Caleb refused to allow himself to sleep. He sent a message out by telegraph to the authorities. 2 days later, representatives of the law arrived in town. The ledger Sarah had protected did the rest of the work. Jubel Halloway was arrested and taken into custody. His entire empire collapsed under the weight of all the names and numbers that Sarah had carried through hell itself. He died in prison years later, forgotten by the very land he'd tried to own and control. Caleb and Sarah didn't choose to stay in town. They took the reward money they'd been given and bought land out in the Wind River Valley. They built a real home there, one with light streaming through the windows and strong walls, one that was meant for living rather than hiding. They married in the spring, quietly and honestly, with no fanfare. The years passed by peacefully. Children were born into their family. The mountains remained visible in the distance, respected for what they were, but no longer feared the way they once had been. Caleb grew old gracefully. Sarah grew wise with age. On his last winter night, as a storm rolled in over the valley, they sat together on the porch side by side. "You ever think about that day when you first came down to the cabin?" Caleb asked her. Sarah shook her head gently. "You were always going to look. That's just who you are." Caleb smiled peacefully and closed his eyes for the final time. He died, warm, safe, and deeply loved. They are buried side by side in the valley. Simple stones mark the graves, with no grand words carved into them. Just proof that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop walking past someone who's standing alone in the cold.